My name is Sarah Joy Pond from conveners.org. Our one-sentence mission is to help get the right people in the right rooms, having the right conversations to change the world. And our team has had the privilege and pleasure of serving as the Secretariat for the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee, a truly remarkable group of economists, lawyers, historians, and thinkers, many of whom are former regulators themselves, who've come together with the mandate to identify, compare, and recommend changes in fiscal, monetary, and financial regulatory policies that are likely to enable the United States to achieve net carbon neutrality before 2050. One of the topics the committee has been engaging deeply around the past several months is exploring the role that the federal procurement policy and federal supply chain in general could play in accelerating the energy transition. And now we're pleased to share with you this conversation on the topic between committee members Sarah Bloom Raskin, Jay Shambaugh, and Gina-Gail Fletcher. We hope you enjoy it. Talk to me about why this moment to address green procurement and what's different about now that makes it a high leverage intervention.
So I think one of the things that probably makes this moment unique is that we're in this point in time when it's not that people are talking about green procurement for the first time, it's that the right people are doing so. So with the Biden executive order, what we have here is the federal government making a real serious effort, right, to kind of put green procurement at the center of federal acquisition. And that is a real bold step, and it's an important step. It's a really necessary step to kind of get the rest of other actors moving along that same vein. So I think that this moment is unique in that regard.
Yeah, I'd say Gina-Gail's exactly right. And the other aspect of this EO is that it really peels back into the supply chain. It actually goes deeper than a kind of surface approach. And that's significant. I mean, that is something that can actually have real impact.
And I would just add, by going deeper, it can start to set a standard. There are lots of companies that are thinking about greener procurement or setting their own internal prices on carbon or things like this. And by the federal government stepping forward and showing kind of a best-in-class approach to this, they can hopefully motivate a number of other actors, whether it's states and localities or whether it's large companies, to actually shift their own policies into a greener direction.
And what do some of those best-in-class approaches look like?
It's not just looking at it from a surface level standpoint, right? Just saying, well, we'll use more recyclables here, which is very important. Nobody is disputing that, but also going further in and thinking not just about what the federal government itself is doing, but what parts of its supply chains are also doing. And then thinking not just about scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emission metrics, but also scope 3, right? And scope 3 is the one that we've all kind of been backing away a little bit from because it's too hard to measure. But I think with this EO, with this momentum that we have behind green procurement, it's possible that we can start to tackle some of the harder questions about what these metrics should look like. And so maybe we don't have that best in class just yet, but we're moving closer to it and moving to it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it actually creates almost, in a backdoor sort of way, the public-private kind of partnerships that you need to move this forward, because of course a lot of the procurement from the federal government is going to come from private suppliers, right? So it actually forces a green focus beyond just the immediate purchase at the federal level. So it does have this kind of virtuous cycle component to it.
And also, I think in terms of what does it look like, one of the big things is pushing for information. So requiring suppliers to actually count up their emissions costs. And, if I'm a small business owner and I'm looking at different suppliers and I said to them, well, I'd like to know what your carbon footprint looks like. And I'd like to know, the different stage emissions here. They'd look at me and say, your business is not worth that. But the federal government's business is worth that time. Mm-hmm. And once the federal government does that, then that information can be available to others, or at least it becomes, if a firm doesn't want to disclose it, that's telling you something, because they've calculated it, because if they're doing business with the government, they had to. And so I think that becomes a really important leverage point to once again, to push the impact of this beyond just what does the federal government buy directly, this product versus this product, and to really broaden the impact.
Are there any potential equity concerns around that? Is there anybody who's going to be shut out of working with the government because they don't have the capacity to do that kind of measurement? And is that something that needs to be taken into account? Or are we just talking about big enough contracts that you ought to be able to do it?
So ideally, this would be done with equity in mind. And that, by the way, that equity component is important in all government procurement, not simply green procurement. But to Jay's point and this, gathering of information component, I think one thing that will be learned is going to be whether smaller suppliers, whether minority-owned suppliers, whether, suppliers in different rural communities are getting access to this, to be able to partner with the federal government. And that tells us something. That could tell us essentially where there are pockets that are going to maybe need some kind of special purchasing or selling subsidy. And, that's another component of that has to get examined. But, I don't think equity concerns just happen without there being a focus on them. So this might help get that focus if the EO and its directives roll out in a way that demands it.
And I think another thing, just kind of building on that, we do need to think about how do we bring these smaller businesses in, right? So that it's not just the larger companies or the large companies that are getting the benefits from, the federal contracts because they can count easier or because they can make that green transition more easily. And so we need to find ways to support, to train our smaller businesses, our women and minority-owned businesses in rural areas that would have some, that would be interfacing with the federal government. And then also to kind of bring it back to one of Jay's earlier points with state and local governments, right? To think about how we're going to support these types of businesses to help them make that transition and to help them to be able to gather the data, maybe not to the same level of granularity as we would require of a multi-billion-dollar large company because of their footprint, but we would still want to think about, thinking about how to gather data even for that small entity in a way that is not onerous, burdensome, or further shuts them out from the economy.
I would just add that I think that the key point here is not that you simply move to a scale where the carbon emission is the only thing that you consider in procurement. So obviously, if something is just massively expensive or if it violates other goals that you have, you don't go in that direction. The point is to say, we shouldn't just be looking at monetary cost. We should be looking at broader costs to society and the economy, and by bringing in climate impacts. And that doesn't mean you ignore your other goals, whether it's around small businesses or minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses. Those goals can still apply just as much as before. As both Sarah and Gina-Gail just said, you may in fact need to scale up those a little bit depending on the impact of this policy, and you need to be cognizant of that. And I really do think Gina-Gail's last point is important, that it maybe what it says is you need to help those firms run the calculation. So the whole concern is that what you're doing is adding some sort of regulatory burden that they just can't hurdle, that they just won't go over, and they'll say it's not worth it to me. And maybe what that will say in some cases, especially for smaller firms, is the SBA needs to actually help them do the calculation and figure out how to do it and figure out how to optimize their own supply chain to reduce their footprint so that they become more competitive in these types of bidding competitions.
So you mentioned the cost benefit analysis that goes into this, which made me think of the social cost of carbon and what role it plays in this whole implementation. Where is it useful? Where might it not be? What level should we be setting it at? How might we use it?
So I would say the social cost of carbon, the goal of it is to say, in some sense, what is the cost to society if we add up all the costs over, out to infinity in their present value terms, what is the cost of emitting one more ton of carbon, right? And so what it's trying to do is put it into a monetary cost so that you can compare it to other things. And so you're trying to pull in the health costs, other damages it's going to do to the economy, other damages it's going to do to life and health, and put all of that into a single number, which lets you in some sense add it to a cost benefit analysis in a much more tractable way. And so I think in that sense, it fits very nicely into these types of calculations. You wouldn't want every purchasing manager and every single agency to have to be running cost benefit analysis on every single purchase, a set of principles or priorities, whether it's EPA or the Climate Task Force or someone giving advice as to, well, for pens, this is better than that, or things like, there might be some where you don't want to run it in that way, but for large scale purchases, and especially ones that have emissions impacts over long horizons, it makes a lot of sense to say, well, let's add this up and figure out what this is going to be and how do we weigh it against the monetary cost. Because if emitting 1 fewer ton of carbon is going to cost you $100,000 more for this one thing that you're purchasing, that's probably not an efficient place to reduce emissions. And that's what the goal of this is to figure out where can we efficiently reduce emissions as much as possible.
So one of the things I'm super curious about around this is it seems like doing anything at the federal level just takes forever and is a really onerous process. So could there be ways to sort of fast track pieces of this or to fast track the whole thing? Is there a place where we would want to prioritize quick wins? And are there areas where the long process to hash out what this really means is worth it?
I think, we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good here. To the extent there are some agencies that are ready to go, I would say, you move forward with them first. To the extent there are particular types of procurement that are ready to go, I can imagine fast tracking those. So I think there's no reason to wait for it all to be perfectly assembled before any of it gets done. And my sense is the Biden administration understands that. They're going to take a pragmatic approach to this. And they're going to think through, where it is that they could achieve some momentum. And typically, as we see in so much of government, you sort of do the low-hanging fruit first and go with it and create some impact and some important signal. And then you essentially tackle the harder pieces. But no, you make a great point. There's no reason to hold up everything while every T gets crossed and every I gets dotted. You can go with what you have.
And I think there's a good case for, in some sense, dual tracking, right? That you try to set the permanent policies in place, going through all the regulatory processes that are hard and that are time consuming, and trying to set that in stone so that it's there over time. But as Sarah said, you don't want to leave lots of opportunities waiting for that. And I think the one thing I would say, and I think you've seen the executive order pushes in this direction from the Biden administration, is to think about some of the things that have really long-reaching costs and trying to make sure you act on those right away, because there are going to be things that you're buying literally year after year after year. And if for 1 or 2 years we don't get those right, we can course correct. But when you're buying a vehicle, that's going to be in the federal government fleet for a long time. And so the decision you make today has longer reaching implications. And so trying to really move the ball in those areas where you're talking about buildings and you're talking about cars and you're talking about, kind of in economics jargon, irreversible investments. Those are the things you really want to make sure you're getting right today, because you don't get a chance to revisit them quite as often. And so I think that's another place where you can say you can prioritize some things because you just know they're going to have a bigger impact, while you at the same time try to pull everything along as quickly as possible.
I think the only thing I would add to that, which is a bigger thing, but also a much softer thing, is the culture, right? So the culture within agencies, in that as they think about what they're doing or how they're doing some of their own procurement, to start thinking about some of these things, right? Is travel by plane really necessary? Or can we do some of these meetings virtually by phone? Like, as you think about the different things within an agency or within a body and how they act, for, sustainability to be a part of that thinking of the agency. And agency culture is hard to change, but it's also something that I think is key to making sure that this is a long-term change, because, once we start down that path, then I think it'll be easier to get a little bit more buy-in, the further down you go in terms of the employee structure and who's thinking about this and how that's being implemented.
And Jay, this as well, the cultural piece is really, it's, as you can imagine, it needs work, right? It needs work. And an EO, a well-structured EO, it does have the effect of catalyzing that cultural change, because there are deliverables, there are dates, and these kind of milestones actually serve to actually get an agency Gina-Gail, to your point, sort of acculturated to what needs to get done. So there is that benefit, and it's both a benefit and a challenge.
Yeah.
I'd also love to pick up on just the example Gina-Gail gave there, which is the fact that green procurement doesn't necessarily mean it has to be more expensive. It's not that you're buying the more expensive thing because it emits less. In many cases, what it's saying is, let's take into account the full cost to society of this decision we're making. And the classic example here is getting on a plane or not. Just the monetary cost to the agency is one thing, but there are broader costs to the agency. And so there may be cases where it redirects activities in a way that is both greener, but also less costly. And so it's just important to think that this is not just something where you're going to make everything in the government more expensive in the goal of reducing emissions. It's, again, trying to figure out the way to be efficient here and make sure the government is not putting extra costs into society for no reason, just because it wasn't counting them. The point is to count those extra costs of these emissions.
And not to put extra costs just because that's the way we've always done it.
Yes, and that's where the culture part is so important, is reminding people that we need to do something different.
Excellent, thank you. Now, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the committee in general with a lot of our recommendations is durability and the ability to make these changes last beyond any one given administration.
It's a great point. But procurement, in my experience, is kind of a sticky process in the sense that it takes a while to gear up, but then once you have it kind of in a certain lane, you have the people, you have the processes, you have the means to actually keep it in that lane. Now, the flip side of it is you have to get it into that lane, and you have to get it there in a way that you have the right people, you have the right processes, you have the right procedures. That takes work. But once you've got that, you're monitoring it and you're keeping an eye on it. I think you're actually there, and you have created, in essence, a momentum, a set of habit. And that's actually a good thing in this case. And the EO starts down this path. It's going to force certain processes, people, and procedures to be developed. And once that happens, I think can be, self-replicating.
And when we get through that multi-year process of all the rulemaking that comes with it, I also think that we'll find that rulemaking process, or the rules that come from that, will also have their own level of stickiness.
So to the extent, of course, that that there's something that needs to change in terms of the procurement, which of course there's going to need to be, right? You don't want that rigidity so completely embedded that you can't ever get off course. That's what the markets are going to do. That's what essentially that kind of adaptability is going to bring about. So I think we're okay. I think
yeah. And I think one of the other things that's important too, building on that market point, I think the market will also show us, to some extent, markets are not perfect. I don't believe that, but they'll show us to some extent the things that are not working, right? The things that are not as green as we thought they were, or not as efficient as they thought. Like maybe we thought this wouldn't cost this much, but it ends up costing a whole lot more. Or maybe this is something we thought would cost a lot, but the market's showing us that no, it can do it a lot more efficiently, a lot more cheaply. And so, right, we can steer into that curve a lot more. So I think that market point is also really key, because the markets are flexible, but the markets also reflect back to us a lot of information. Once we kind of demonstrate certain preferences, I think then we get a lot more information back as well.
That's right. And I think to Gina-Gail's last point there, it's not that the federal government is just going to suddenly buy from firms that are currently green, right? The firms will adjust. If they find out they're going to lose federal contracts because once you add in their carbon costs, they're no longer the low-cost producer. Some of them may not be able to adapt to that, but many of them may. Many of them may have actually pretty low-cost ways to become far greener, but they just never had the incentive to do it. And so suddenly the cost of shifting in this direction could be much lower than you imagined.
I love how hopeful this last few minutes have been. That's really kind of exciting. We don't often get that when we're talking about climate transition.
To me, what is also a hopeful sign is the change in the way in which we're talking about things like green procurement, We're no longer talking about it in terms of, well, this is something that's going to cost the government a lot of money. This is something that's going to cost a lot of jobs, or this is something that's going to, put industries out of business. The change in the language that's being used around these issues is also, to me, a huge bright spot, because the way we talk about things, the way we process these things verbally as a society, and the way, that makes a huge difference as to how we see them and the importance that we give to them. So instead of talking about going green or a green transition being something that's going to cost us billions of dollars, and we don't even know what the benefits are going to look like, and that kind of negative approach to it from a language standpoint, and I'm always bringing in the soft things, right? But from a language standpoint, right, I think that makes a big difference. And to me, that is a bright spot, that we're seeing this now as a job creator, as a way to generate better future, and to think not just of the costs of doing this, but those benefits, and putting dollars to that benefit, right? Not just being something that's a little bit more pie in the sky. And I think, to me, that's a great bright spot.
So if you could just wave a magic wand and one aspect of the federal supply chain would transition instantly to a really robust green procurement process, what would it be?
I'd do electric vehicles. And I know the executive order says that's what they want to do, but to me, it's very impactful. There are ways to take carbon emissions out of the energy markets, and we're making progress on that, and that's happening. But the transportation sector is just really hard unless you transition towards something like electric vehicles. And it's just the kind of thing that it could be impactful, again, in its spillovers, at not just the direct emissions, which themselves are really large, but in the spillovers. You're going to need a lot more charging stations and things like that if the federal government has this fleet, in which case then it's much easier for a private car owner. And US firms already understand they're going to need to massively scale up their ability to supply this market if the federal government is really going to buy this many electric vehicles. It feels like it's a place that can be so important. So if I got to pick one, that's the one I'd.
I like calling out the cars. I think there's a real potential here to really tackle something that is going to make a difference, as well as, send a signal to other industries and to, even the supply chains integral to cars, that this is going to be quite significant.
That was impressive to me when we were researching this, because when I first heard, the federal government's going to make its whole fleet green, I was like, okay, and then we dug into it more, and it was like, okay, 600,000 cars. That's significant, especially when compared to what the electric car market currently is. It's more than double what was sold in the US last year. You all have talked so much about the markets and those ripple effects of what happens in marketplaces, and that seems like a perfect example of that.
Well, if Jay's already picked electric vehicles, then I'm going to go ahead and pick solar panels, renewable energy. When you think about just the size of the federal government, they have buildings everywhere. And, just being able to use solar panels, again, the spillover effect of that, I think, will be large, right? Because right now, solar panels are quite expensive. And I think that the more we have, for example, the federal government buying into those more, because I believe that they already do it to some extent, but to do it more, right? And to have different types of renewable energy be the way that we power these gigantic buildings, Virginia and DC and Maryland, right? That go on for days. Anybody who has lived or does live in DC knows that almost every other building is a federal government building, right? So thinking of renewable ways to power these large buildings in the nation's capital and outside, right? Federal government buildings are everywhere. Renewable energy plan for those would be my magic wand, since Jay took vehicles.
I would say, for the magic wand question, one thing I would love to do, time is of the essence here. We all kind of realize that. But one thing that is going to come from this work is going to be jobs. There are going to be new jobs that are created, and there are going to be people moving from existing jobs to these new jobs. And it would be great if we could pause where we actually stop and assess our success. This is going to have the kind of impact that should be measured, not just in terms of the green products that are getting purchased, but these collateral benefits that are huge to the economy. And, we're probably, I'm not sure that that's going to be, that there's going to be necessary time for that, but I think that it's important to see the impact that this could have on people's livelihoods and quality of life.
So Jay's going to wave his magic wand and flip over 600,000 cars. Gina's going to wave her magic wand and power 100,000 buildings. And Sarah's going to wave her magic wand and stop time.
This is quite the magic wand.
Right? Good one, right? Thanks again for joining us. And please reach out if you have any questions.